Back to Hegel. Somewhat efficient here. We've talked about his four critiques of Kant. That is actually one of the more difficult aspects of Hegel to get. And I hope it still working its way into your minds. But today I want to focus on the way in which Hegel himself saw himself as a synthesizer of various philosophical strands that had gone before. He really did kind of view himself as the last greatest philosopher in history, which most philosophers do. And he wanted to mention how many of the other great philosophers in history had made contributions that, he felt mixed in and sort of supported his. There's many of these, but I'm only going to mention a few because these are ones we've touched on. So I'm leaving out philosophers we didn't talk about because it would be less meaningful. But one that he specifically mentions is Heraclitus. He goes back and he finds in Heraclitus a contribution that will serve in his own philosophy. And what do you suppose that was? What would it be, Krista, do you think, that was a contribution from Heraclitus that Hegel found serviceable in his own philosophy? And she looks back into her well-indexed, highly organized, color-coded notes that she'll keep with her all through her college career. And she finds what?
That everything is in flux.
Very good. That is precisely correct. Hegel is convinced that everything is in flux, and Heraclitus stands more than any other philosopher for the idea of the flux of life. That's his great contribution, and so Hegel incorporates that. But, interestingly enough, Hegel also appeals to Parmenides. Because, of course, Hegel sees himself as the great synthesizer. And he thinks that though Heraclitus and Parmenides seem to be completely irreconcilable, they stand, it seems, in completely opposite positions on things. Nevertheless, he thinks there's something in Parmenides which is useful. What do you think that is? Spencer, what do you think? What's the chief characteristic of Parmenides? What do we remember him for?
I
Don't remember. Oh dear. What do we remember Parmenides for? Kayla, do you recall? Parmenides, what's the catchphrase? The one little phrase that's sort of first thing that comes to your mind when you think of Parmenides, and it is, go ahead, Ben.
Whatever is.
Whatever is. Parmenides is the philosophy of being. Being. Heraclitus is the philosopher of becoming. Becoming versus being. Hegel incorporates the becomingness of Heraclitus, but also insists that there is, and remember Parmenides is a rationalist, there is this rational component as well. And where do you suppose we find it? You know enough about Hegel now to take a guess. Where do we find this notion of rationality championed by Parmenides? Where do we find that in Hegel? Buddy? Stab? Joe? Where in Hegel do we find this rationality principle that he traces back to Parmenides? We find it in his
It doesn't seem like a rash.
Well, he is. He believes he's the champion of rationality. It would be where, Sarah?
His idea of the dialectic and argumentation.
Yeah. Well, yeah, not sort of. There's another point where it comes up. All right. One of the names he has for God is the name reason. Reason. He believes that though things are in flux according to a principle of rationality. And Sarah has the right instincts She thinks, like a good scholar, that when you have A and not A, and you have a dialectic between them, that it's going to take the application of reason to find out the right answer. This is where Hegel's a little weird. Because his answer to this is what? Reason doesn't resolve that. Because for Hegel, what? Jordan?
You say that both.
They're both true. He embraces the contradiction. They're both true. So reason, in a sense, is born out of the contradiction. Reason is lifted out of it. Geworfenheit is the term that he uses. You don't need to know that. We'll test you on that. But this is that which is lifted out of the contradiction. And we, in a sense, affirm both sides. So he uses the word reason, but he uses reason in a unique way that is really, up until that point, unheard of. Because it seems, up until Hegel, that reason means getting the right answer. This does remind me of a lawsuit I had once, representing a PhD third grade teacher. She taught third grade in a public school, and she had her PhD. And she was very good. But she'd been teaching probably for, 40 years, I guess. She'd been around. She was an older lady. And, but she was, I don't think she was any kind of flaming fundamentalist or anything like that. She was a Christian, but not in any sense kind of, hardcore type. But anyway, she got fired. And she got fired because she was beginning to voice concerns about what at the time was called outcomes-based education. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. It's part of what used to be in the state of Washington a program called Visions 2000. And they were going to use in public schools this methodology known as outcomes-based education. Sounds good, doesn't it? We want an education that produces good outcomes. Doesn't that sound like an appealing idea? We care about outcomes at the we'd like you to be able to read and write as an outcome by the time that you graduate, that sort of thing. But outcomes-based education, in the sense that it was being used in the public school, was a fully Hegelian experiment in education. And I won't go into all the details of it, but she was telling me just one of the things that had troubled her. She said in third grade that part of the kind of drill that she was supposed to use with the students would be to give them a math problem. She'd divide them up into like 4 groups. Group 1, Group 2, Group 3, Group 4, And she'd give a math problem. Maybe a division problem or whatever kids do in third grade. I don't know. I know I never learned it, so it doesn't matter to me. But anyway, then she'd want the 4 groups to work on it and come up with an answer. And what mattered was not whether they all got the right answer, but whether they all agreed on the answer. So it was an exercise in consensus building. And so the whole deal was the group had to work on the problem, and if they succeeded in getting everybody to agree to an answer, they'd give a thumbs up. Even if it was the wrong answer, they still got full credit for the exercise. And it was that kind of thing that she was constantly being required to do that began to make her a little concerned about, do these kids ever learn to do it right? And people, oh, come on. What we want is for them to build agreement, And she started going, I'm not sure that in the third grade, that's the most important skill. I think maybe a more important skill is getting the right answer to the long division question. And she got canned. She raised that question enough times. Polite, she's a nice lady. But she just kept going, I'm not sure this is what we should be doing in third grade. And they fired her. So we sued them, and they settled. Would have liked to have taken that one to trial, but they offered enough money, we had to take it. So anyway, that's kind of a Hegelian approach to mathematics. You got an answer here, an answer here. Reason sort of incorporates some kind of consensus building. Isn't that fine, Spencer? You go out on the baseball field, you got the grays, you got the blues. We don't care who wins, we just want consensus, right? Isn't that the way the game is played? We don't care about win, we don't have losers. It's just the fun of the game. Every time you see that, you're in Hegel's universe, or some effect of it. Go ahead.
Well, I was just wondering, using the analogy of a math problem.
Yeah.
Would Hegel say that if somebody took a paper and said 1 + 1 = 2, but then somebody else said 1 + 1 = 3, would he say they're both right?
He would, the problem with Hegel, if you put that question to him that way, frankly, I don't know what he'd say. His description of things is always so complex and convoluted that you're never quite sure. But when he talks about these issues, he's always talking more about great ideas than about simple math. The problem is it's trickled down in our culture to where it affects things like simple math. You see the difference. So I honestly don't know what Hegel would say in response to that. I think Hegel knew how to do simple arithmetic. But oddly enough, his philosophy, I think, has been one of the great enemies of doing simple arithmetic. Yeah.
I was just curious if some of the public schools here in Washington still use that.
I don't know what the state of the philosophy of public education is today. At the time, I was quite interested in that and did some public school lawsuits that were related to things like that. But I've been out of circulation for 10 years and I just don't know. I haven't kept up. I think there were quite a few teachers who began to get a little heartburn. And so I think they at least had to renegotiate the use of that methodology. But where we are today, I'm not sure. I'd like to know. I just haven't taken time to look at it. All right, so anyway, Parmenides stands for reason, and Hegel thinks that he is being true to the rational tradition, even though his notion of reason is a little bit weird, according to Gore at least. Another philosopher that he appeals to and likes to incorporate and believe he's relying on is Aristotle. You could probably guess that Aristotle would have to make the list. There's one particular theme in Aristotle that is his most important contribution that Hegel tends to highlight. And because time's getting away from us, I'll just tell you what it is. You can write it in. But it's Aristotle's whole treatment of the distinction between potentiality and actuality. Aristotle, as you may recall, has a notion. We talked about form and matter. We talked about some things being more actuality, some things being more potentiality. Does that kind of ring a bell? We talked about that. And God is pure actuality, remember that? And pure potentiality would be nothing. But everything kind of is a mix. And Hegel likes that. He grabs onto that because, of course, in his philosophy, we are all in a state of potentiality, but we are all heading toward a great conclusion. Hegel is a utopian. He believes that while this dialectical triad continues with all of these conflicts, that's what I'm trying to picture here, a conflict, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, leading to new thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and so on. This progress is heading towards some kind of great, final, climactic, perfected state in which all of history, which is in fact God, reaches its final, ultimate actuality. He believes we are all, in a sense, evolving with God. God is evolving in us. But you really can't talk about progress. Progress is a meaningless term unless you have an end point. Unless there's a final conclusion, you don't know what you're progressing to. Progress implies conclusion, right? And so, Hegel had to suggest some kind of final conclusion. And this conclusion would be pure actuality, and so he felt like Aristotle was kind of, suggesting that. That was out there. I might mention, by the way, just a little footnote, but pay attention to it. After Hegel passed from the scene, there were two groups of followers. One were called Hegelian, and one were called young Hegelians. Okay? Always be careful when you hear about a group called the young something or other. You never quite know what you're dealing with there. The young Hegelians believed Hegel, as did the Hegelians. The difference was, this would be the difference between conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrats. All right? The Hegelians believed that they had basically reached this great, wonderful, utopian situation, and they believed they had reached it in 19th century Prussia. We're here! The young Hegelians felt that we're only going to get there through revolution. That we have to overthrow the existing paradigm and then we'll get there. We need to, in a sense, blow up what is now here. This conflict needs to become somewhat violent or even bloody to get us there. And it's out of the young Hegelians that you get who? Who's the great revolutionary Hegelian? What's his name? You all know his name. Come on. Who is it? The great revolutionary Hegelian is? Yes, say it. Oh, just say it out.
Karl Marx.
Of course, Karl Marx. Who thinks the only way we're going to achieve this utopian situation is by destroying the present structures of society, which are in fact impeding progress. And we'll see more about them as we go along. All right. So those are at least three philosophers that he mentions. There are others. I'm just mentioning them to sort of illustrate the way he works. He works by looking at each philosopher and trying to pull out something that he finds serviceable to his own philosophical ideas. I think you know from our conversations that the very heart of Hegel's philosophy is captured in this notion of the dialectical triad. This is actually a bit of an oversimplification, and there are Hegelian scholars who would doubt that you could ever find this particular idea as such in Hegel. Hegel is somewhat more complicated than this, but it is certainly Hegelian, and it's so commonly associated with Hegel that I think I'm on safe ground to give it to you in this context, but with a little caveat that there are those who would doubt this. The fundamental idea is certainly there, and that is that you have conflict. You have the so-called thesis, you have the antithesis, and usually you have this conflicted situation in which you think somebody's got to win, somebody's got to lose, and then it resolves into thesis, but the thesis itself becomes another, into synthesis, which becomes another thesis, and so on. You just have this kind of ongoing evolution in which conflict produces change, and the change is inevitably a change in the direction of progress. And that captured the public imagination. Well, it captured the philosophical imagination of the 19th century. So that virtually everybody was thinking in terms of struggle and progress and evolution. I've mentioned some of these to you, but just to make sure you're thinking the right way. We mentioned the other day who is the philosopher of the 19th century who takes this notion of progress through struggle and applies it in the biological sciences. His name is, of course, Sarah,
Charles Darwin.
that's Darwin. The guy who applies it in the world of political conflict, most famously would be a guy by the name of, we just mentioned him, and that would be Stephen, go ahead, we just mentioned him. Megan, who is it?
Marx.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, Marx. But notice, even though Marx and Darwin are operating in two different disciplines, they both premise their disciplines on conflict. Marx is about conflict. Darwin is about conflict. Who is the Hegelian in the 19th century who applies Hegelian categories to psychic forces, saying that fundamentally it's happening within us? And that man's name is Jordan? Freud. Remember, Freud has a kind of inward dialectical triad. But you know what it is? What's the internal psychic dialectical triad in Freud? You ever studied Freud? Know anything about it? You got the id. You ever heard of that? Id. The superego. And they're in conflict. The id is your basal instincts. Your desire to go do bad things because you're basically a bad person. And then the superego is there. Your conscience says, naughty, naughty. Don't you do that. You have to behave yourself. And so here we are in this conflicted situation, and stuck in the middle between id and superego is what Freud calls ego. And you have a constant resolution of the conflict in the ego, being torn back and forth between these two. And there's progress in that. Psychotherapy is an attempt to help you make progress in connection with the conflict. So Freud is just taking Hegelian ideas and putting them into this sort of psychological scheme. Yeah.
So you said Marx used conflict politically and Freud used it psychologically. But
Yeah.
what did Darwin use it?
Oh, biologically. Yeah, sure. Again, you've all written down now and have committed to memory. I should have put this on the quiz. Matthew, what's the matter with me? Write down the full and complete title of Darwin's most famous book, right? Isn't that a great quiz question? It certainly will be a test question. Can you do it? Ben, can you give it to me? What is it? The full and complete title of Darwin's most famous book?
Origin of Species.
Yep. That's the part everybody knows. Now it's the rest of it. Yeah, Matthew's trying to whisper it to you.
Something about natural selection.
Yeah.
Something about nuts.
Can anyone do it without looking at your notes? Okay, here it is. Make sure you got it. I just gave it to you. The origin of the species by means of natural selection, comma, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle, the dialectic struggle for life. Right? The title of the book tells the story. Not saying that Darwin didn't do biology. He did biology. He was on the Beagle. He went to the Galapagos Islands. He saw the finches. He saw all of that stuff. I mean, obviously he was a pretty good observer of nature. I'm not trying to discredit that. But please understand there's a difference between observing nature and interpreting nature. And his interpretation is pure philosophy. None of it's demonstrable. It's a theoretical construct by which to accommodate the data. Right? And that's a very different thing from simply doing observational biology. All right, who took Hegel's approach and applied it to the discipline, oh good heavens, and applied it to the discipline of jurisprudence? We looked at this guy briefly last year in civics, a great Darwinian, atheist, considered a great thinker in American jurisprudence, and his name is, everybody? Coming? Josiah? Oliver Wendell Holmes. Law evolves. you see. That's why he's one of the greatest enemies of the American Constitution. Because the American Constitution is based on the idea of fixed natural law. But Kant told us, and Hegel basically agreed, there ain't no such thing. So now we've got an evolutionary approach to law. Ah, such great stuff. See ya. See you in a week.